My father didn't just take me to court. He stripped me bare with his words. In front of neighbors who once smiled at me, he called me useless, a shame to our family, a mistake that should never have been born. Laughter rippled through the room, and in that moment, I realized he hadn't come for justice. He came to destroy me. My name is Geraldine Prescott, and this is what he never expected me to reveal. The county courthouse smelled of varnish and old paper, its benches filled with familiar faces from town. I sat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes lowered, as my father took the stand like it was a pulpit. His voice rolled across the room, steady and booming, each word sharp and to cut. He pointed proudly toward Daniel, who sat in the gallery, polished shoes gleaming, his wife's perfect smile, and a child on the way. Then he turned back to me, his tone curdled with contempt. "And then there's her. Nothing but a burden, nothing but shame." A ripple of laughter broke through the silence, not loud, but enough to pierce like a blade. The whispers carried down the rows, as if the hearing itself were some small-town spectacle. I felt every glance land heavy, like stones thrown in a public square. I lowered my gaze to the table, tracing the grain in the wood. For a heartbeat, I wasn't in that courtroom at all. I was back at our kitchen table, watching my mother polish it each Sunday after church, humming softly under her breath. That memory pressed against the present, holding me together when everything else seemed determined to tear me apart. I didn't flinch. I didn't answer. I breathed the way I had trained myself for years. Steady in, hold, slower out, hold again. The room thought my silence meant surrender. They mistook stillness for weakness. Inside, I told myself the truth he refused to speak. He might own this moment, but the story he was performing wasn't the whole of me. He could take the floor today, but the truth he'd spent his life denying would come for him soon enough. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains of my small apartment above the bakery, carrying with it the smell of fresh bread and coffee from downstairs. I was halfway through tying back my hair when a knock came at the door. The mailman stood there, holding out a stiff yellow envelope. My stomach tightened before I even touched it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as though it already knew what it carried. I tore the seal, eyes racing across the words. Court summons. My father was petitioning to sell my mother's house, the house where I took my first steps, the house where she hummed gospel tunes while cooking cornbread, the house where she breathed her last. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the envelope dangling from my fingers. It wasn't anger that flooded me, not at first. It was something colder, heavier, like a stone dropping into a dry well and echoing endlessly at the bottom. That house was the last tether I had to her, the last place that still felt like mine. And now he wanted it gone, scrubbed from the map, the same way he always tried to erase me. A smaller slip of paper slid free from the envelope, handwritten in his blunt script. 4 words, nothing more. End the game. Geraldine. I stared at it until the letters blurred. To him, I wasn't a daughter. I was a pawn, a piece to be moved and sacrificed when the board demanded it. I folded the note back into the envelope, my pulse steadying against the sharp edges of the paper. If he thought he could cut away what was left of her, he was wrong. Some games weren't his to end. The attic groaned beneath my weight as I pushed through the hatch. Dust rose in the narrow beam of the single bulb, and the air smelled of cedar gone brittle with age. Boxes sagged against each other like old men leaning on canes. I pulled one forward, its marker ink label faded. Utilities. Inside, a stack of yellowed bills and receipts, edges curled and fragile. I lifted them carefully, expecting nothing more than years of forgotten payments. But buried near the bottom was a small notebook, the cover soft with wear. My breath caught when I recognized the handwriting, my mother's looping script. I flipped the pages, notes about repairs, grocery lists, small prayers scribbled in the margins. Then I saw it, a line written in uneven strokes. Paid 9/12. Don't tell Peter. I froze. My hands shook as I turned the pages. Month after month, The same entries. The dates matched the years when I had vanished from town. The years no one could explain. She had known. She had tracked every payment I made, and she had hidden it from him. A memory pulled me back. A night at the kitchen table, her hand covering mine, her voice trembling but steady. "I trust you." She never asked where I had been, never questioned the bruises I couldn't explain. She just waited, and she protected me with her silence. I lowered myself onto the attic floor, the journal heavy in my lap. The light flickered above, throwing long shadows across the beams. Tears blurred the ink as I whispered, "You always knew, and you chose silence for me." The truth pressed against me like armor, a reminder that even in her quiet, she had been my shield all along. The courthouse felt tighter this time, every bench full, the air thick with perfume and sweat. My father rose again, the microphone catching his voice and amplifying it until it echoed against the paneled walls. He gestured toward Daniel, parading his stability for everyone to admire. Houses, a wife, a future. Then he turned that same hand toward me, his tone curling into contempt. "She's never held a real job. While Daniel builds a life, she hides in some rented attic teaching a few kids to plink at pianos." A ripple of approval moved through the crowd like a low tide. His lawyer called an elderly neighbor to the stand, her voice quavering but eager to please. "I see her all the time, alone at the market, never working at anything useful." Whispers slithered down the rows. "Right, she lives off someone. Always disappearing." The lawyer laid a thin folder on the table. Bank statements spread out like a wound. Years of empty deposits. No clear income. I sat perfectly still, my fists pressed together under the table where no one could see. Each word from the witness box landed like another stone on my chest. From the corner of my eye, I caught sight of Mr. Alcott in the last row. He met my gaze and dipped his chin once, a small, steady nod that said more than words. "Hold your ground." The laughter, the papers, the smirks all blurred into one noise. For them, the verdict was already decided. I was nothing. Rain ticked against the window as I shut the apartment door behind me. The smell of yeast from the bakery below drifted up, mingling with the damp chill. I pulled back the rug, pried open the square of floor I'd sealed years before. Dust rose like a ghost when the metal lid of the safe swung free. Inside lay the envelope I hadn't touched since the day I came home. Heavy stock, red seal. The emblem pressed deep into the paper. My fingers trembled as I slid it open. The words were stark, official. Geraldine Prescott, 12 years active service, special operations, classified assignments, mortgage contributions verified by the Department of Defense. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Every bruise I'd hidden, every month I'd vanished without a word, every lie I'd been forced to tell this town, compressed into a few unyielding lines. I hadn't wanted to show it. To expose it meant surrendering the only part of my life that was truly mine. But he had left me no choice. The next morning at the market, Mr. Alcott paused beside me, his hand resting on his cart. "You don't owe this town a thing," he said quietly. "But when the time comes, let me stand with you." His words hung in the cool air like a promise. I understood then this fight was no longer about walls and deeds. It was about my mother's memory, and whether the life I'd risked everything to live would be erased or finally seen. The heat pressed down on the courtroom that afternoon, the ceiling fans barely stirring the heavy air. My father strode in with the confidence of a man who believed the ending was already written. This time, he didn't just rely on his words. He brought others with him. The first was a retired accountant, spectacles perched low on his nose. He cleared his throat and declared, "In all my years reviewing records, I never saw Geraldine report steady income. She never paid consistent taxes." The next was a neighbor, her voice sharp with certainty. "She disappears for months at a time. I can't imagine how she survives. Someone must be supporting her." Murmurs rolled through the benches like a wave crashing against stone. "She's a leech," someone whispered, and the word caught, spreading from row to row. I sat unmoving, though my hands trembled beneath the table. My father watched me with a gleam of triumph, as if each accusation were another nail sealing the lid. Then his lawyer produced photographs, grainy images of me returning to town years ago, clothes threadbare, bruises still dark along my arms. "This," he said smoothly, "is the picture of someone reckless and unstable." The gasps and whispers grew louder, rising until they drowned the hum of the fans. I bit down hard, steadying myself against the surge of voices. Their trust in me was gone. I could feel it bleeding out of the room. But inside my bag, the envelope from the Department of Defense weighed heavy. Hot as an iron brand, I wasn't ready to press into the world. The hearing stretched on, the room tense enough to snap. The opposing lawyer turned to me at last, his voice sharp, questions flung like daggers. "Where were you during those years you disappeared? How did you survive? Who paid for you?" I lifted my head, met his stare, and answered evenly. "I served something that cannot be written in public record. Those who have ever worn the uniform will understand." The laughter was immediate, low and cruel, spreading like smoke through the chamber. My father shook his head, smirking, satisfied. To them, I had just confessed to nothing at all. Then, from the gallery, Daniel's voice broke through, uncertain, stammering. She vanished even when Mom was sick. I asked her where she went, and she never answered." His words landed like fire on dry grass, igniting the crowd. People muttered angrily, shaking their heads. My father's smirk widened. But then my eyes found Mr. Alcott in the back row. He placed his hand firmly over his chest, gave me a single, deliberate nod. No words, just the weight of recognition. It was enough. I sat there caught between the roar of scorn and the quiet strength of that gesture. The choice was clear: remain silent and let them bury me, or reveal the truth I had carried alone for 12 long years. I could feel the edge of the decision beneath my feet, the drop yawning wide. The moment to step forward was nearly here. The courthouse was packed so tightly that elbows touched, breaths mingled, and the walls themselves seemed to press inward. After days of accusations and whispers, the crowd was primed for my collapse. I could feel the anticipation hanging in the air like a storm about to break. My attorney rose slowly, her chair scraping against the worn wood. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she slid a thick envelope across the table, the red seal catching the light. The clerk carried it to the bench. The thud it made on the judge's desk felt like a drumbeat in my chest. He broke the seal, adjusted his glasses, and turned the pages. The sound of paper shifting filled the silence. No one in the room dared breathe. Then, his voice cut through the stillness. Geraldine Prescott, 12 years of active service in the United States Special Operations, classified assignments, mortgage payments on the disputed property verified by Department of Defense allotments. The words rang out like gunfire. Gasps rippled through the gallery. My father's face drained of color, his mouth slack. Daniel bowed his head, unable to meet my eyes. Around us, neighbors who once laughed now sat stunned, jaws open, whispers scattering like startled birds. And then, from the last row, Mr. Alcott rose, his back straightened, his hand lifted in a crisp salute. The old wood benches creaked as the room fell into absolute silence. That single gesture carried more weight than every insult ever hurled my way. I didn't weep. I didn't smile. I simply stood taller, letting the truth do what it always does, speak louder than any voice raised against it. The air inside the courtroom still hummed from the weight of what had just been revealed. The judge's words lingered like a bell that refused to stop ringing, and every pair of eyes turned to me. My attorney gave a slight nod, and the judge cleared his throat. "Ms. Prescott, you may speak." I rose slowly, the wood of the bench groaning under my hand as I steadied myself. My voice, when it came, was not trembling or sharp. It was calm, carrying the weight of something that had lived inside me for far too long. My mother, I began, letting the silence settle around the name, believed music could keep a person standing when everything else threatened to break them. It was her anchor when bills piled up, when winters stretched cold, when life felt heavier than she could carry. She passed that belief to me, and it carried me through more than she ever knew. I let my eyes sweep across the room. Faces once twisted in mockery, now softened, uncertain. That's why I'm creating the Margaret Prescott Music Scholarship, for children in this town who can't afford lessons, but still hear something inside them worth nurturing. Instruments, classes, maybe even tuition one day, whatever it takes to keep the music alive where she once sang. There was no applause, no cheer, just a shifting in the room. Some lowered their heads as if ashamed. A woman near the back wiped her eyes, and I realized it was my old middle school music teacher. Her shoulders shook quietly as she cried, and for the first time, I felt the current change. Then, as if on cue, my father shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His face was flushed, voice rising with fury. "Don't turn this into a spectacle! Don't you dare use her name!" Before he could finish, the judge raised his hand sharply. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Prescott, sit down! Do not force me to hold you in contempt!" The courtroom froze. My father's mouth snapped shut. His jaw twitched as though he might explode, but he sank back into his seat, red-faced and stripped of his dominance. For the first time in my life, I saw him silenced by more than just me. I exhaled slowly, my gaze moving past him. In the far row, Mr. Alcott stood tall, his eyes locked on mine. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his lips shaping a single word I had longed to hear but never expected: respect. The word wrapped around me like armor, and I felt something loosen inside my chest. For once, the silence in that room wasn't heavy, it was reverent. The porch light hummed faintly, its yellow glow casting long shadows across the steps. Beyond it, the yard lay in darkness, alive only with the rasp of crickets and the steady whisper of wind through the pines. I sat on the swing, the chain creaking softly as it rocked, when headlights swept across the grass. Gravel crunched beneath tires. Then the engine cut, leaving the night in sudden silence. My father climbed out of the truck, his figure outlined in the dim light. There was no swagger in his steps this time, no booming voice announcing his arrival. He walked slowly, his boots heavy on the wood of the porch. In his hands, he carried a small wooden box, its paint chipped, its corners worn smooth by years. He set it carefully on the railing between us, his hand lingering for a heartbeat before pulling away. His voice came low, almost unsure, stripped of its usual bite. "I won't call you useless again." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "I don't need you to be proud of me," I said. "I only need you to stop lying about who I am." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he closed the lid of the box with a soft click, pulled it back to his chest, and gave a short nod. Without another word, he turned. His shoulders slumped as he descended the steps, the sound of his boots fading into the gravel drive until the dark swallowed him whole. It struck me then, for the first time in decades, he had left without shouting, without venom, without the last word. There was no thunder trailing behind him, only the quiet hum of insects and the sigh of the trees. I leaned back into the swing, the night air cool against my face. The house around me no longer felt like a battlefield, but like a sanctuary. I filled my lungs with the scent of pine and old rain, let it settle deep inside me, and released it slow. The weight I had carried for years, his scorn, the silence of my secret, the shadow of his voice, slipped away with that breath. What remained was simple and unshakable. The truth had been spoken. My mother's memory stood intact, and the house was mine, not because of a legal victory, but because her love had never left these walls. I stayed there under the porch light, listening to the steady song of the night, and felt a peace I had never known. For once, the quiet belonged to me. It 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 belonged